The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, folks. This is Dr. Charlie Hall at Texas A&M University, holder of the Ellison Chair in International Floriculture, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, and we have a great one. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our sponsors, so let me just make a quick shout out to our Southern Risk Management Education Center, who provides some grant funding for this particular webinar series, as well as the Texas Nursery and Landscape Association. And then lastly, but certainly not least, AmericanHort, the consolidation of ANLA and OFA, has graciously sponsored this webinar series as well. So we've got a great topic today. We'll be talking about immigration. In fact, the title of that is Everything You Need to Know About Immigration for this year. And we've got a great speaker, and I'll introduce him in just a second. But if you look at your screen, it probably looks a little bit like what you see depicted here, where you've got your window that's going to be showing the PowerPoint presentation. Then you have your control panel. And in that control panel, you can do lots of things. You can open and close that thing by just clicking on the orange button, just like that. And then also, if you want to see the presentation a little bit bigger, you can make it full screen. Excuse me. And then you can, if your audio is having issues, if you've got your headset and it goes out for some unknown reason, don't fear, because there's always a telephone number. You can click on Use Telephone and through your audio setup, and you can plug in the phone number and an audio pin and connect via the phone if you have to. Now, by default, whenever you log on to this webinar, all of your microphones are muted. Now, I don't do that just because I don't want to hear from you. I do that because we want to eliminate any feedback issues because not all computer systems are created equal. And so you do have an opportunity, however, to ask some questions. And you've got a little question box in that control panel. So that's very important, because we're going to go about roughly 27 and a half minutes, 27.35 minutes in terms of presentation. And then we're going to open up for Q&A, because that's where we get some really great interaction. So just pop your question in there. We'll try to address those. Now, at the very end of the webinar today, you're going to be taken directly to a very short evaluation survey. It's 5 points. It'll take you all about 37 seconds. But it's very important for me because it gives an idea of not just the importance of this particular webinar, but what you think about topics for the future and those kinds of things. So it's very important in terms of justifying the folks that are sponsoring this webinar series to know that we're doing a good job. And of course, you'll receive an email after everything is all said and done, probably sometime about this time tomorrow, with a link to the recording. Today's session is being recorded, so if you get called away during the webinar, don't fret about it, because you'll have a chance to view the recording. And if you know folks that would benefit from seeing the recording, then you can sure share that link with them as well. All right, so let's get into this. Let me introduce today's speaker. We've got Craig Regelbrugge, who's the Senior Vice President for Industry Advocacy and Research, formerly with ANLA. And of course, when ANLA and OFA merged to form AmericanHort, he serves that role for AmericanHort and has been doing so since 1989. So he's a senior citizen on the Hill in terms of tenure, so to speak. And so we're delighted to have him with us today. And so, Craig, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Charlie. It's always good to be with you. And, for those of you in the audience, we call Charlie a lot of different names, but my favorite is AmericanHort's chief economist. We all look to Charlie for his tremendous insights on where things are and where this industry is headed. Lots to cover. It's tall billing to basically give you everything you need to know in what's a fairly short number of minutes. Hey, there you go. But we're going to try to do it in 27.35, I think was the order, minutes. We're going to try to give everything that you need to know about this topic. And as the fortune cookie said, may you live in interesting times. We certainly are in those. There is bear with me. Hey, Charlie, I'm not advancing at the moment.
Okay.
There we go. There is a saying, this is a Southern expression, it's okay to look back, just don't stare. And so with that in mind, next slide, please. I'm going to tell you what I mean by that.
See if your arrows will work now.
Yeah, they're not, Charlie. I don't know why I'm getting a sound, but they're not.
Okay.
Let me try one other thing. Okay, we're gonna roll with this, and then I'll try one more time in a moment, Charlie.
Okay.
So don't look back, it's okay to look back, just don't stare. I wanted just to briefly remind everybody that in the last Congress, which ended at the end of last year, the 113th Congress, the Senate actually did manage to pass a broad bipartisan bill, comprehensive immigration reform. It did that on June 27th, 2013. The bill may have a lot of things you'd quibble about, but I'm here to tell you that the agricultural provisions, which would include nursery and greenhouse growers, in the Senate bill were very comprehensive and very, very sound. If we could have those provisions as law tomorrow, we'd be in a great place. If it had happened back then, we'd be in a great place. Beyond agriculture, recognizing that the immigrant labor is important in other aspects of our industry, like the landscape industry, we had improvements to the H-2B program, and we had a new visa program in the non-agricultural context. The structure of the program was good, although there were artificially low caps on how many visas could be issued that were kind of problematic. But all that didn't matter at the end of the day, because the House, rushed to criticize everything that the Senate did, and then the House promised that it would act, but the weeks and the days, the weeks, the months went by, and the House failed to act, which brings us to a very key consideration. When is the best time to move immigration reform legislatively? And the answer is always yesterday, or last week, or last month, and it is rarely tomorrow or next week. This is an issue that is a heavy lift under the best of times, and the longer Congress waits to deal with it, the closer they are to the next two-year election cycle. And so it's always better to act yesterday rather than tomorrow, and that's part of the reason why we're still stuck. So I'm going to talk on several levels about the environment that we're in, things that are shaping the environment. I'm going to move through these very, very quickly, but the place to start, obviously, is the November 2014 elections. In the November 2014 elections, we saw Republicans take control of the U.S. Senate, as I'm sure you're aware. The Republicans hold 54 seats. The Democrats hold 44, and then there are two independents, including one self-proclaimed socialist, that being Bernie Sanders of Vermont. But the two independents caucus with the Democrats, so functionally it's 54-46 is the way that stacks up. Now, an important thing to bear in mind, the Senate has very elaborate and, you might say, arcane rules. And there are key procedural hurdles in the Senate that you can't cross unless you've got 60 votes. So bearing that in mind, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell from Kentucky in the Senate can't move legislation without the support of some Democrats. And if he loses a few of his own, he needs that many more Democrats. So bipartisanship, as unpopular a concept as it seems to be in our Congress these days, is still essential to anything moving through the United States Senate. Over in the House, John Boehner is still Speaker, although about 24 of his colleagues didn't support him in that quest. He has, at least in theory, a somewhat stronger hand with about 13 seats picked up over the past Congress. Here you see the balance of power with 3 vacancies. We'll call them the scandal seats, mostly. And those will get filled at some point here. But so the Republicans hold a pretty good working majority, but on so many issues, they are not all in agreement. And the simple fact is, if there are a couple of dozen Republicans who disagree with the Speaker's direction on any issue, and they peel away, it jeopardizes the House's ability to move legislation. And bipartisanship, though it's not quite so apparent why it's important in the House, rarely do you see legislation move without some bipartisan support, so that remains important. Bear in mind in the House, a simple majority rules, and so 218 is the magic number. You need to piece together 218 votes, whether it's all R's or whether it's a mix of R's and D's, in order to actually move legislation. Now, the GOP controlled Congress. The first 50-day mark just passed not very many days ago, and at least according to this golden retriever, those days have been kind of rough. We've had some interesting showdowns over things like funding of the Department of Homeland Security and the president's immigration executive actions. And I think it's rough has been the word, and rough might just continue to be the word, because as you go forward, we're going to have other fights over federal spending and other types of policy issues where it's going to be really, really challenging for Speaker Boehner to hold his conference together. So indeed, we're living in the interesting times that the fortune cookie promised. So far this year, it seems like the hardliners in the House have kind of had the upper hand, but they obviously missed the geology class that focused on topographical features, including box canyons, which are narrow canyon features that have one way in and, by extension, one way out. The Republicans have managed to box themselves in and have basically had to retreat out the way they went in a couple of times already, and so you might sort of wonder whether there is enough of a mainstream to begin to overcome the hardliners, but the hardliners have been very, very vocal and problematic in terms of the ability to lead the House forward at this point. Another thing worth mentioning, because it becomes an important fact on immigration, is that House leadership is treating their committee chairmen as at least lesser gods. The committee chairmen are being given a lot of deference in terms of setting the agenda and in terms of moving the legislative process forward. So when it comes to immigration policy, we have to be very thoughtful about who's holding the levers of control at the committee level. I'll touch on that a little bit more in a moment. I already mentioned we've got to get to 60 in the Senate. The Senate's under Republican control now, but it's also smart for us to be thinking about what's coming up in 2016 and 2018. A third of the Senate will be up for election in each of those years, and it's already having an impact on how people behave. In 2016, Republicans have a really steep hill to climb. They will be defending somewhere on the order of about 24 seats in states that Barack Obama carried. And so they're going to have a real hard time holding the Senate in 2016, and then the Democrats have their version of that problem in 2018, with some members coming up for re-election in states that are quite conservative. So all that shapes how people vote today, and we have to try to figure that out. Key point, bipartisanship doesn't seem to be all that fashionable, but it is important. Leader Mitch McConnell has probably been looking for the cruise control switch, and that's just a way of saying that there is not sort of unanimity among his conference and the Senate either. Makes for some pretty interesting driving. I mentioned the chairman being deferred to very seriously, and these are the chairmen of Judiciary. At the top is Bob Goodlatte, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. In the middle is pictured Charles Grassley, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then chairman of the Immigration Subcommittee, Jeff Sessions from Alabama. I bring these folks up because these folks on immigration policy have always been, to varying degrees, hardliners. I think there's at least a little bit more room in the case of Bob Goodlatte and maybe Chuck Grassley to have a conversation about parts of our issue, like the agricultural piece. But these folks have been pretty tough hardliners and are not inclined to be worrying a whole lot about moving policy forward that's very bipartisan. So this is going to be a challenge for us as we go forward. Another challenge, and this is a Republican challenge, and I think it's a counterpoint if everybody's saying, oh, there's no way anything's going to happen in this Congress. Thought leaders in the Republican Party are under tremendous pressure to figure out how to broaden the base, broaden the appeal of the Republican Party, especially as we're talking about the 2016 presidential election and increasingly statewide races. They understand that if the party can't figure out how to change the conversation with Hispanic voters, with Asian voters, with other new American voters, with, frankly, with young people and women. If they can't figure out how to change the conversation with these population groups in the United States, they're going to have a very difficult time getting back into the White House and, as I say, increasingly statewide offices in a growing number of states. Hispanic voters, for what it's worth, care about the same issues as most other voters. They care about things like jobs and economic opportunity. They care about education, and they want their children's lives to be better. But if the place the conversation starts is, you know, it sounds like these folks are trying to deport my grandmother, it's hard to get to those other issues. A final factor I'm going to talk about, I'm calling the O factor, and this is another hurdle to overcome in this environment. This is, I mean, Barack Obama has become, in the eyes of some, such a polarizing figure that there are those who will quietly say, if the president's for it, I'm opposed to it. That's just, it doesn't matter what it is. And so unless we can overcome the O factor, then it's going to be very, very difficult to see Congress act on immigration reform and actually get something across the finish line, recognizing that Mr. Obama does have a veto pen. Going to be real hard to do that until we see a new president sworn into office. Okay, I'm going to switch gears. We'll come back to Congress and the outlook there toward the end of my remarks, but I want to shift gears for a few moments to talk about the announcement that the president made last November, basically saying, I'm tired of waiting for Congress. I'm going to use my executive authorities to their fullest to do what I can on immigration. In all fairness, it is worth noting that every president, every sitting U.S. president since Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s has used executive authority to grant temporary immigration relief to one or more groups in our society. The largest example happened in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush era, where over 40% of the then unauthorized population that had kind of been left behind by legislation that was signed into law by President Reagan in 1986 was dealt with on a temporary basis through executive action. But over the years, executive actions have touched on many different populations of people with many different public policy imperatives. So I throw all this out just simply to say that the president is not the first one to act in this fashion, although admittedly his actions, if they stand, will affect more people than these earlier examples. The executive actions in brief, he did many things. A lot of what the president did is not a source of controversy, and that's redirection of many enforcement resources. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that item except to say that we may see less in the way of worksite enforcement, I-9 audits of employers. We may see those go down over the next 2 years as those resources are redeployed toward things that are considered to be higher priorities. The other things the president did, and I'll really talk mostly about the third one, there was a modest expansion of an already established program called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. These are people who were brought to the United States as minors, sort of not exercising their own free will, and they've grown up here. There were some modest expansions of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And then probably most importantly and also most controversially, there was this new Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, or DAPA, program. Now, all this, we're talking in hypotheticals because a federal judge in South Texas, federal court in South Texas, has weighed in and has issued an injunction against particularly the DAPA program. And so now there is a pitched legal battle underway, which might make it all the way to the Supreme Court. So it's a race on how fast do the courts ultimately deal with these legal challenges versus what's the expiration date on the Obama administration, and we know that. We have elections in November, and the administration will November of 2016, and the administration will change in January of 2017. So the clock is ticking, and I'm not going to predict what the courts will do, but everything that I'm about to say, is predicated on the notion that this program goes forward. Okay, so the Deferred Action for Parents, who is eligible for this, at least in theory? A person will have to prove that they've been here for at least 5 years, continuous presence. They will have to prove that they have a U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident child. Most commonly, that means they have a child who was born here. And they'll have to pass a background check. If they do all that, they will receive a 3-year reprieve from being deported. And the carrot, if you will, is that they will also receive a general work authorization. So they would be able to legally work during that 3-year period. The program, at least in theory, was set up to be launched in May of this year, although again, the court battle may slow down that process, and we're just going to have to wait and see. There are a lot of unknowns about what would happen here. There's the unknown of how many people would actually come forward and seek this status. I mean, after all, somebody who's in the shadows now, who doesn't feel an immediate threat of deportation, might say, I'm just going to keep my head down and wait and see what happens, because this policy could be overturned, it could be reversed by a new president. Why would I come forward and put my name on the list to be deported? On the other hand, the carrot of a legal authorization to work and to sort of live outside of fear of being in the shadows is going to be attractive to some people. So we don't yet know how they'll behave. There are also concerns that if a lot of folks do come forward and receive general work authorization, it may actually speed up their attrition, particularly from agricultural and seasonal employment, which is a common phenomenon in our industry. So there are some concerns that people may move on to better employment opportunities, including in industries that are using the so-called E-Verify program. But in any event, we're awaiting critical guidance, and we're probably not going to see the guidance until there's some clarity coming from the courts about whether or not the president has exceeded his authorities. Okay, let's switch over for a moment and talk about the existing legal visa programs. We could spend a full hour talking about what's going on with these programs, and we don't have that. But just to hit a couple of high points, there is an existing visa program called H-2A, which is for temporary and seasonal employment in the agricultural sector, including nursery and greenhouse production. And there's a program called H-2B, which is, again, temporary and seasonal, but non-agricultural employment. This program, the landscape industry, is the largest user of the H-2B program, although many other industries, ranging from everything from hotels and restaurants to rock quarries to minor league baseball, actually use H-2B visas. I'm not going to say a lot about H-2A right now. It's a very expensive and bureaucratic program. It has been fraught with delays and challenges in the past. You know, so we spend a lot of our day job hours helping folks who are in H-2A troubleshoot its problems. But this season so far, we haven't seen a whole lot of trouble in the H-2A program, and usage is beginning to tick upwards. Probably this year we'll see usage possibly even reaching 100,000 visas. Now that's out of a total ag workforce of 2 million, so it's still a drop in the bucket, but it's growing in its importance. Most of the action this year has been on the H-2B side. There is a cap on how many H-2B visas can be issued. The total cap is 66,000. It's split into 2 semi-annual apportionments. So the first half of those visas go for the first half of the government fiscal year, which just ended, which is just ending March 31st. And then the second half of the visas are released for the second half of the fiscal year. But the program, you know, basically has been in regulatory and legal chaos. In plain speak, the Labor Department has been trying to import into H-2B all of the things that make H-2A unworkable. They've been taken to court. Various employer groups, and we have supported these efforts, have taken the Labor Department into court, and frankly, we have won a recent major legal battle in court. But in sort of retaliation for the employer's victory in the legal battle, the Labor Department essentially shut the program down a couple weeks ago. Literally shut it down, said we're going to stop processing applications for labor certification. So at a really critical time of year for the landscape industry, suddenly the wheels stopped turning. There was huge bipartisan pushback in Congress. Many of you helped in that effort, and the program has been restarted, but we're going to have residual delays for a while. And we have a bunch of people this year who were caught up and blocked because of the cap being hit. And so we have a lot of landscape people in places like North Carolina and Maryland and so forth, whose applications were almost through, but then they got caught up in the cap and they're having to start all over again. So we're going to have some challenges in the weeks and months ahead because of the non-performance of the only existing legal visa program that we have in the non-ag sector. Okay, so let's jump back to Congress and the outlook in Congress. And I'm mindful of the time and want to be sure to leave some time for any questions that you all have. Um, where are we? There's two ways to interpret, and they are kind of the polar opposites. There's two ways to interpret where we are in terms of the outlook in Congress. The optimists would say there must be a plan, that leadership, particularly in the House, is allowing the hardliners to punch the punching bag until they're just tuckered out from it, and then ultimately cooler heads are going to prevail, and people who are actually concerned about the Republican Party's image as a party that is able to govern are going to step in, and we're going to see a stepwise approach that begins to take on the immigration dilemmas piece by piece. The opposite of that is there is no plan. And that in fact, we were just lurching from crisis to crisis. As I alluded earlier, there are more crises over federal spending and the debt limit and other things. There may be more crises ahead. There may be more threats of a government shutdown ahead, and the fear is there's no plan. I gave a speech on this subject in California last week, and I asked for a show of hands. How many think there's a plan? How many think there's no plan? And the unanimous opinion in the room was there is no plan. Unfortunately, I'm afraid I agree. With all that said, if we can get Congress to act, I think here's how it's going to look. Number one, the House will go first. The Senate did the heavy lifting last Congress. There is very little appetite in the Senate, particularly with the new majority, to speculatively do the heavy lifting again and hope that the House acts. So they're going to wait. They're going to wait and see. House is going to have to go first. So right now, we are doing everything we can to engage Judiciary Chairman Bob Goodlatte and to try to persuade him to move an agricultural bill that actually solves. That's where he's going to start. If he does anything in the employment context, it's probably an ag bill. But our job is to make sure that it works for the nation. He had a bill in the last Congress that made some improvements to the current situation, but it just didn't get us where we needed to be for the future. So those efforts are underway. But I have to tell you, the risk for us is that there is a real zeal, I could almost call it a bloodlust for enforcement in this Congress. And so, everybody's talking about moving a border security bill. They're talking about interior enforcement. They're even talking about making the E-Verify program mandatory. E-Verify is the federal program that at the time of hire allows you to check against federal government databases like the Social Security database whether a person is legally present and authorized to work in the United States. And many are arguing that they've got to make that the law of the land before we have a conversation about our employment needs. That is very troubling because normally in the legislative process, you have to give a little to get a little. And in this case, giving up everything with a promise that we might get a little is a risky place to be. And if E-Verify were imposed without better solutions for our current workforce and for future visas, we are in a world of hurt in agriculture and in seasonal employment especially. And so that's the challenge. I think the gun is to the head. The threat is real. The wolf is at the door, whatever cliche or analogy you prefer. In the employment context, the high-tech industry and the ag industry are kind of uniquely favorably positioned for some kind of consideration. We've kind of made our case on the merits, and it's just a question of getting folks to own solutions beyond just enforcement. If the House actually gets something done, we still have the problem of regular order in the Senate. I think there's a chance that Leader McConnell would find a way to bring a bill right to the floor rather than seeing it torn to pieces in the Judiciary Committee given its current makeup. But for all of us, and you included, the task at hand is educate, educate, educate. Our best hope, I am an optimist, not a foolish optimist, but an eternal optimist. I think at some point this problem will get resolved, and let's hope it gets resolved well because the alternative ain't pretty. But our best hope in terms of moving forward is if we can get a critical mass of Republicans who are angry about what Obama did on immigration with his executive actions, committed to legislating. I mean, look, at the end of the day, if they don't like what Obama's done, their best opportunity is to replace it with something better. So if they legislate and do so wisely, that's half the puzzle. The other half of the puzzle, equally challenging, especially as the 2016 election ticks closer, is getting a critical mass of Democrats who decide that supporting solutions, even solutions where they might have to make some pretty major compromises, is better than simply riding this issue to the ballot box and using it as a wedge issue with Hispanic voters and others. So we need a critical mass of R's to want to legislate and a critical mass of D's who decide solutions are better than the status quo and the wedge issue. And then ultimately we're going to need to have the policy be thoughtful, because we really do need to solve a major problem for the nation. So the road ahead, it is a curvy road. It is a hilly road. We've seen it before. We kind of know it. I want to make just a quick comment on a point that I'm going to call details do indeed matter. We have two problems in this industry, in the green industry. We have a current workforce that includes a lot of folks who are hardworking, experienced, they've been here for years, they are trusted and respected by their employers, they have shown documents that appear legitimate on their face, but if the truth be known tomorrow, they're not. If the music stops tomorrow, if there is E-Verify tomorrow, these people would potentially get filtered out of our workforce, and we don't have the solutions it would take to replace them. So we need a solution that deals with the present, we need a solution that deals with the future. We would argue that it's going to take a little bit of a distinct policy approach to solve each of those problems. If all Congress gives us is a better future visa program, and then they say you got to take the current workforce and just shoehorn them into it, folks, here's what happens. Just in agriculture, aside from the landscape industry, somewhere between 1.1 and 1.5 million of our experienced agricultural workers are believed to be unauthorized. And trying, again, the legal program as it now exists struggles to admit 100,000 of them. So the legal program is going to have to expand at more than tenfold if it is the only solution out there. And I personally don't have enough faith in our government institutions being able to ramp up and do that, considering what we've learned just with what they're trying to do now. So we need something that is practical and streamlined and doesn't require people to march out of the country in order to march back to be authorized to work in our industry. We really need a distinct solution for each of these problems. Secondly, one of the hot button issues for Republicans is all about a path to citizenship. I think there are ways to thread that needle. I think that there are ways to find a solution for the current workforce that is sort of silent on the question of whether or not there's an indelible or clear road to citizenship. What we really need in the near term is work authorization, but I think any legislation that either guarantees a clear path to citizenship or that absolutely prohibits any future possibility of citizenship, either approach is going to fail. We need to figure out how to thread the needles, and it's like doubles tennis, as they say, down the middle solves the riddle. And then finally, we've got this interplay with enforcement. I want to warn everybody, once again, the threat is real of enforcement measures moving without reform. And the challenge is incumbent on us to make it clear to our politicians that that is not an acceptable approach, that they ought to move reform and they ought to move enforcement together, and the two ought to balance each other. That's the right way to solve the problem. There are a number of folks in Congress who want to help us, and I think, for all of them, rather than having 20 people introduce their own variation on a guest worker bill, for example, we need the people who want to help us to come together and work together, and that's a job that we're working on inside the proverbial beltway of Washington right now. Also, the perfect is the enemy of the good. We're never going to get perfect in this debate, but on the other hand, we cannot accept a bad deal or two slices of a loaf. We won't get the whole loaf, but we need more than two slices for the nourishment that is needed across our industries. We won't get a second chance if we accept a bad deal. I'm going to end on a point I made before, which is educate, educate, educate. The job of reaching out and helping people in Congress understand why this issue needs fixing is as much yours as it is mine. I mean, I'm working on this end on your behalf, but we really need you all to take the time to invest in educating your member of Congress. One of the easy ways to do that, you can go to our website, AmericanHort.org, click on the Advocacy and Issues link, and then click on the Voter Voice link. That takes you to a special advocacy, mobilization website, and we've got current campaigns going on, immigration generally. We've got a current campaign going on H-2B. And you can easily, in a matter of a couple of clicks, you can easily send a message to your member of Congress. Those messages matter, numbers matter. So at least take those few minutes. If you can go beyond that, best way to go beyond that is to figure out how to build a relationship with your representative in the House, starting at the local level, and starting at the staff level. Reach out, make it part of your business to introduce yourself to the staff, see if they want to come out and tour your operation, learn more about your business. You can band together with others in the industry that are like-minded so that this is a group effort and it's not too much heavy lifting for any one person. But at the end of the day, especially for our Republican friends, and we approach this issue in a nonpartisan manner, but for our Republican friends, immigration activists or unions are not going to convince them to be for immigration reform. It's going to be people who share their values. So it's going to be people like you who are employers, who are providing a payroll, who are contributing to the economy. You are the people who need to be connecting and explaining why we need a rational solution on this issue. My favorite saying as I've been going around the country on this issue and others this winter is as follows: everything will be right in the end, so if it's not right, it's not the end. And indeed, it is not yet the end, but one of these days we're going to get there if we continue working together. With that, Charlie, I would be, if you've got any questions from the group, I'm happy to drill in to anything I've touched on sort of superficially or just whatever people need or want.
Well, that's a great job, Craig. That's a good quote to end on. Someone should include that in the movie.
This is not a Regelbrugge original. Somebody came up with this somewhere, and I need to do my research so that I can properly credit them.
It's that Marigold Hotel movie or whatever it was. That was the Indian guy that said that over and over. But it is apropos for this point. And we've had several questions, and I think you've touched on elements of those, but I'm going to kind of walk through those and see if there's anything else you want to add to them. So I'm actually going to combine a couple of these questions. And, the first was, presuming that the courts ruled that the president was within his jurisdiction to do as he did, as an employer, what would you do? In other words, what advice would you give? And I'm going to combine another question that is this a good thing or a bad thing for business?
Gotcha. Okay, I'll touch on both of those, and very, very good questions. Thank you. I think, one perspective is that, this Deferred Action for Parents program, or for that matter, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, these are not about the employer. They're not about the employment relationship. Unlike the legislation that passed in 1986, where employers were specifically compelled to do certain things with respect to the programs that were launched, in this case, it's not about the employer. It is about an individual being able to prove essentially two things: one, that they've been present for at least 5 years or more, and two, that they in the case of the Deferred Action for Parents, that they have a U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident child. And neither of those things is about the employment relationship per se. That said, we fully expect that if the program rolls forward, when the guidance comes out, one of the ways in which people will be able to prove 5 years or more of legal presence is through proof of employment. And that's where the employment nexus, whether we like it or not, can happen. So our first note, and probably our last note too, is a cautionary note. Your employers may come to you with a request for employment verification, proof of their employment, for many different reasons. They could be applying for a loan, they could be applying for a scholarship, they could be doing many different things. You don't need to know why they're asking, and you really don't want them to tell you. So rule number one for an employer is don't ask, don't tell. If somebody comes to you requesting their employment history, you should have a policy that says that they're eligible. They have a right to that information, and you will provide it, no questions asked. You do not want them coming to you and saying, I am going to apply for this Deferred Action for Parents program, because the moment they've done that, you have actual knowledge that they are unauthorized to work in the United States, and it becomes, you know, a serious crime to employ somebody knowingly who is not authorized to work in the United States. So protect yourself is rule number one. I think rule number two, I know from talking with our industry's employers that there are many of you, if this program rolls, you want to be helpful. You want to actually, you know, do what you can to help trained and experienced and you know, quality people be able to earn their way. And you know, this is not a full-blown legalization, it's a temporary reprieve from deportation, but if folks want to avail themselves of it, you want to be helpful. In those areas where there's a real density of labor-intensive agriculture, sometimes there are third-party organizations, community organizations. They may or may not be faith-oriented, who provide programs and services to immigrants. And in some of those cases, I mean, Ventura, California would be a great example. Parts of the Central Valley of California, great example. You've got these community organizations that are sort of balanced in their approach. I'm not talking about a labor union, for example, which sort of has an opposite approach. But these balanced organizations may create a safe place for your workers to go and learn the facts and not be taken advantage of. So if you have access to those third-party organizations, people can be sort of pointed in that direction so that these conversations don't happen in the lunchroom or in the personnel office. They happen off campus, away from the workplace. And most importantly, people can get good information, because we are very concerned that unscrupulous people will prey on, you know, these very, very desperate folks and promise them things and happily take their money. So that's going to be important. I guess the place where I'm going to end on that question, Charlie, is to say, is this good or bad? Both perspectives are out there. The employer, those who are advising employers tend to focus on the cautionary notes, and they tend to say, you know, gosh, why would anybody put themselves at risk of coming out of the shadows and essentially signing up for deportation with all the uncertainties around it? And if they do, you know, we're concerned about employers, you know, gaining too much information and having compliance problems as a result. So most who are advising employers are kind of on the cautious side of things. On the other hand, people who are advocating for the rights of immigrants are quick to say that in our nation's history, once we have crossed the threshold of granting temporary relief to people, rarely do we then turn around and deport them. So in their view, this program, if it stands, is a stepping stone, and that stepping stone might be the best opportunity that some fraction of the 4 million or so potentially eligible people are going to have. The best way forward for them to be able to come out of the shadows and start a process, which is probably eventually going to go further, is to take that first step and to get into this program. So those are the perspectives out there, and you know, I can't tell you right or wrong, good or bad. I imagine on this phone there's some people that are cheering it on and some people that are unhappy with it. At the end of the day, my hope is that it is a catalyst, and that whether you like it or hate it, that the president's program becomes a catalyst for Congress to actually step in and do the job it needs to do.
Exactly. Now, let me follow up with a couple more. There's one question that basically, I'll paraphrase, if you've already been approved for H-2B, do you have to worry about actually getting your workers?
Well, it depends where you are in the approval process. The H-2B program is as is H-2A, is really a dance that involves 3 federal agencies. The first step in the process, you're making an application to the Labor Department for what's called a labor certification. This is the process of proving that you have a need that you're unable to fill with domestic workers. So you have to go through advertising for U.S. workers, hiring any willing and available and qualified U.S. worker for the job, etc. So the labor certification is the first hurdle. The second hurdle is with a branch of the Department of Homeland Security called U.S. CIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. And there, once you have the approved labor certification from the Labor Department, you are then petitioning Homeland Security for the right to get a visa for these workers. And then the third step is the actual approval process, the admissions process, which is handled by the Department of State at one or more foreign consulates abroad. A lot of these people come through Monterrey, Mexico, but there are various consulates that do this work. So if you were caught by the cap, if your application was otherwise moving along smoothly, but you were caught by the cap, which is, the cap is really on Homeland Security for how many visas they can issue. If you were caught by the cap, you pretty much have to go back and start over. We're trying to figure out, and every now and then, every case is different. In a few cases, there may be particular hardship where you can try to sort of avoid starting all over, but the unfortunate reality is for most of our folks caught by the cap, they have to change their dates of need and they have to reapply. If you've been caught by the shutdown, but you already had an approved labor certification, for example, then the process, the wheels should be turning and you should be able to get your visa petition approved and continue on. And then, you know, if you're still in the labor certification application process, you know, it's steady she goes. It's just a question of how long will the backlogs go on. I am afraid that this situation is going to be very, very volatile because of the legal maneuvering that's going on. I'm afraid it's going to be very volatile over the coming weeks. And so, you know, you just, I'd strongly encourage, if you're not a member of one of your trade associations like American Hort, you really need to be, because there's only a few of us who are sort of finger on the pulse, and we'll help keep you advised on where things are.
Exactly, and that's kind of a nice segue to our last question, which is basically, you know, at the grassroots level, what can we as businesses be doing right now? And I think you've already touched on various elements, but I'll see if you have anything else to add there.
Yeah, I mean, we need to be making noise, and I know, I mean, this is a challenge for our industry because, you know, Charlie, you're the numbers expert, but I vaguely recall that something like 60% or more of our business in this industry is transacted in a mere 6 to 8 weeks in the springtime. Maybe it's even higher than that. So we know it's go time, and as spring unfolds south to north, she's kind of slow in the eastern part of the country, not so much out west, but as spring unfolds, folks get really, really busy, and it is so hard to make the time. But if members of Congress are not hearing from you, there is no pressure, and if there's no pressure, there's no action. Just to use an example, on the H-2B front, because of the train wreck of the program being shut down by the government, we were able to leverage a lot of grassroots, and we had a bipartisan team in the House, Representative Harris from Maryland and Representative Lofgren from California, teamed up. They did a sign-on letter to the federal agencies, the secretaries, and really primarily the Secretary of Homeland Security, saying this is untenable. The court decision did not require you to shut the program down. You need to get the program up and running. And lo and behold, in addition to those two, we got 76 members of the House of Representatives, which is a huge number. 76 signed on to that letter, and that helped to create the political pressure that caused the program to be restarted on a temporary basis. So all this is to say, I mean, part of our challenge, Congress reacts to crises, and on immigration, it's really been tough to create a crisis. This H-2B thing, you know, became a crisis in a microcosm. But think about what you can do. Think about banding together locally. Think about, you know, inviting your member of Congress to come out to the business, or you go to their district office. You don't have to come to Washington. We would welcome you, but you don't have to come to Washington. You can set up a meeting with their district office. You can go in and, you know, begin to educate the staff and ultimately the member of Congress, and become a trusted resource. But without you raising your voice, you know, we can. If you raise your voice, we can amplify it. If you're just sitting back waiting for somebody else to solve the problem, I'm sad to say we're not going to see a solution.
Good point. Well, Greg, that basically takes care of all the questions we've had. So excellent job. That was great information. I really appreciate you taking the time this morning to do this. I'd like to also thank for all the attendees for being here, because it wouldn't be possible without you, of course. And just remind everyone that when we close out the webinar, that you're going to be taken to the evaluation section, and please take time to fill out that evaluation. Take you less than a minute to do so, but it's very important. And let me just close. I had a couple of folks just write in, and one of those says thank you, and another one says thank you for your constant efforts. So let me echo that, Greg, that your constancy on the Hill And on behalf of our industry, is much appreciated, and excellent job in sharing some of your information this morning. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. As you know, it's a labor of love.
All right, folks, you heard it. It's a labor of love. And as a reminder, the recording of this webinar you can share with others. You'll get a link in an email tomorrow. So with that, we'll close out the day's session and have a great time until we talk again.